but I went to a place to review a BMW S1000RR. And any of you who know bikes know exactly what I'm talking about. The former fastest production motorcycle in the world. Now, of course, it's technically not, because my favourite bike, the Y2K, is still the fastest ever, but it was the fastest production at the time. A 195 mile an hour, 1 litre BMW Superbike. And for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, it's the BMW that looks like a MotoGP bike, and it has 2 different sized headlights. It kind of gives it like this weird manic look. It's got one big headlight and one round one. I love it. It's asymmetrical design. I love that. Not enough vehicles have it. I get on this bike. It was at Bristol, and I rode it around for about 3 or 4 hours. And it was a pretty horrendous day, I've got to say. It was blisteringly hot. I ended up riding this bike through Bristol city centre in start-stop traffic at midday. I'm wearing a Kevlar-lined hoodie, lined and armoured camo trousers, which are made of textile, so they're not breathable at all. Of course, leather gloves, leather boots, and a Predator helmet with a balaclava underneath. Suffice it to say, I was roasting alive on that bike. The bike itself was getting insanely hot because of the start-stop riding. The heat coming off of the side of it was actually beginning to burn my leg through the Kevlar trousers. And it was kind of becoming a bit of a bad day at the time. And I wasn't like losing focus or anything on the bike. I was just starting to get kind of aggravated and kind of annoyed, because heat for me, and I'm sure some of you can identify with this, heat makes me angry. When I'm too hot, it makes me very, very touchy and snappy and angry. And I'm always too hot. But most of the time it's okay, you know, but when I'm too hot and the day is hot, it was like a 30-degree day in the middle of Bristol. Plus, because, you know, you're in a city centre, so it's all tarmac and brick and buildings, so the heat is just generating. You've got all the people walking around, all the cars driving. So much heat is being generated. I gradually get out of the city. I end up getting lost. I could not find the dealership because I was supposed to drive from the guy's house where he had the bike, which I did. And I was supposed to ride through part of Bristol and go to the dealership. And then at the dealership, we were going to chat about the bike a bit more, swap around the cameras, etc. Okay, all well and good. Problem is, I can't use sat-nav on a motorbike because I didn't have a sat-nav holder at the time, so I was basically using guesswork, just a rough idea of the direction I needed to go. So I must have taken a wrong turn somewhere, ended up in Bristol city centre, as I said. Ultimately, I pulled over, phoned up the guy, you know, asked him where the place was. He gave me directions. I wasn't too far away. And this is where things get kind of ballsed up. Because I'm driving down this road, or riding down this road, I should say. And then I see the entrance to the dealership. And I notice that this dealership has a very, very high curb. I'm talking like a 5 or 6 inch high curb. When you're in a car, you don't even notice something like that. When you're on a motorcycle, you'd better notice something like that, because if you come in on anything but a straight angle, you are going to fall off. I mean, try and go up a high curb on a bicycle without coming at it head on. You know exactly what happens. You fall off straight away, because that's just not how bikes work. It sends the balance off immediately. So I saw this curb, I thought, okay, I don't want to fall off. So I took a wide berth, went out towards the middle of the road a little bit. Traffic was fine, didn't, hit an oncoming car or anything like that. Swung around to give the bike a little bit of a better angle. Bump up onto the curb, all well and good. I then look up, because obviously I was looking at the curb, make sure I was getting up it properly, needing to brake or put my legs down to stabilise the bike if necessary. I'm doing maybe 5-10 miles an hour at the most, walking pace basically on this bike, because I'm entering the dealership. Big forecourt, single car wide lane to get into the place, single wide gate. There's no gate, the gate wasn't closed. There was, nothing there as far as I was concerned. I was just riding into the place. I look up and am greeted with a black chain hanging across the entrance at neck height. Now, I don't know what the best rider in the world would have done at that point in time, but when you're travelling towards a chain, even at 5 or 10 miles an hour, a chain which you had no idea was there, that is about to take your head off of your shoulders, The only natural thing to do is not brake and stop, because that would just totally unstabilize the bike and chances are you'd drop it. You naturally duck. So that's what I did. I ducked to avoid the chain, but when I ducked, my wrists went back, because that's what happens when you duck. Of course, when my wrists went back, I snatched open the throttle and was immediately on this, I don't know, 170, 180 horsepower, 200 mile an hour BMW, going a whole lot faster than 5 miles an hour. And within probably 10 feet, I smashed straight into the front of an Audi A1 that was parked on the dealership forecourt. It was for sale. Like a slightly older generation white Audi A1. Straight into the quarter panel and the headlight. Before I knew it, the bike of course stops dead. The front wheel went into the car. I mean, like inside it, like the car ate the wheel. And I flew over the handlebars and slammed onto the bonnet of this Audi back first. Now, I wasn't hurting at the time. I had some bruises which lasted a few weeks afterwards, but I wasn't hurt at all. You know, my Kevlar hoodie and the trousers and the Predator helmet, they all did their job very well. Didn't hurt at all. But I was very shaken up. And the reason why I was shaken up is actually partially because of my upbringing. See, I mentioned my old man earlier on, and for those who don't know, he did pass away late last year. And basically, he always taught me, my mum as well, but he taught me something which he valued a lot, which is that if you do something wrong, don't do what everyone does. When somebody does something wrong, and I'm sure you can think of occasions like this, you lend something to someone. Could be a car, could be a toy when you were a kid, could be an electronic device, and then that person accidentally breaks it. What do they always do? They come up with some excuse as to why they didn't do it, why it wasn't their fault. They try to downplay it, say, it's not going to be that expensive to fix, is it? You'll be okay. They try to tell you how you should feel about your property being broken. And my old man could not stand people who did that, and neither can I, because they are weak people. People who don't take responsibility for what they've done wrong. Take responsibility, fix what you've done, get it sorted, and move on with your life. Don't be, an attention whore victim, which is what those people are. Take responsibility, get it fixed. So that is exactly what I did. The problem with that mentality is that I had not only the shock of having an accident at significant speed because the bike accelerated so quickly, but now, as well as having the physical shock of having an accident, I've also got the moral guilt of having smashed up somebody else's property in the form of an £8,000 Audi for sale and a £6,000 BMW for sale. And I just couldn't compute the situation. I was essentially in shock. Now, for those of you who also don't know, I am qualified as a first aider and a fire marshal as well as a number of other things. I'm a security officer, fire marshal, as I said, first aider. So being qualified and trained as I am in first aid, I believe I was probably in shock. The signs were certainly there. You feel cold, you don't exactly know what's going on, cold sweats, even though it's a 30-degree day. You can't quite stand up, but you can't sit down either. You feel sick, but you don't. You feel like you're going to cry, but you feel angry. And it's kind of like this weird mix of every possible feeling you can have, which is essentially shock. Now, it may not have been shock. It may have been an anxiety attack, but they're very similar. They have a lot of very similar things anyway. It could have been a panic attack, an anxiety attack, or just shock. I'm not sure which. Either way, whichever it was a bad day. But when the guy got there, the other guys at the dealership, they sat me down. They didn't even see what happened. They just heard the bang. The other guy got there. He noticed the Audi, of course, because the headlight was busted. The bike had actually accelerated so quickly that the impact with the Audi caused the front tire to explode. And I'm talking about the tire on the Audi, not the bike. The car's tire exploded on impact. So the bike must have picked up so much speed so quickly in those 10 or 15 feet. But of course, it's the fastest bike around. Of course it went quick. But even while I was on the bonnet of this Audi, I was still partially underneath the BMW, which doesn't sound like it makes sense because I was thrown over the bike kind of shoulder first, like my left shoulder and head went over the bike, but I was still holding the handlebar, the clutch side, the left side. And somehow, I don't recall how, but somehow my thigh was still under the bike. So the bike must have kind of come with me a little bit. I must have been holding on so tight that the bike kind of came up as well. And the bike sort of landed on my leg against the car. Now, like I said, I didn't break any bones or anything, but I remember the first feeling I had was like the Looney Tunes thing that happens when you just see money signs going across your eyes, but not in a good way. I just saw, like, how am I going to bankroll this guy when I've just smashed up his Audi and a BMW through no fault of my own, but that wasn't the point at the time. It was, how am I going to, rectify this? And it wasn't even just about the money. It was just the feeling of wrecking somebody else's stuff. And I was far more, beat up about it than the guy was. He was, and again, that was why. If I'd been trying to play it off, doubtless he would have been angry. But because he could clearly see I was taking responsibility and felt really bad about it, people are immediately more inclined to work with you, sympathize with you, and not blow their top, but try and actually figure out how we're going to fix this. But the first thing I was thinking when this bike was still partially on top of me was, don't drop the bike. So even right up until that point, I did not want to drop the bike, which of course made no logical sense because I just crashed it into the front of an Audi, but I still didn't want to drop it any more than I already had. Now, ultimately, we ended up just basically having a quick conversation about the two. He said that technically his insurance didn't even cover it because it was on the grounds, and his insurance, for some weird reason, didn't even cover vehicles driving on the forecourt, which makes no sense to me. I think that they may have been concerned about me potentially suing them, because at the end of the day, if that's the entrance to a location, you should not have a black chain hanging across the entrance. If the chain does have to be there should be a warning sign hanging off of it, which there wasn't. It was literally just a black chain. So I suspect that if I'd chosen to sue, even right up until now, because it was only a few months ago, I could probably still sue them right now. But that wasn't my inclination at the time, and to be honest, it still isn't now. Because that's, generally speaking, just not the kind of person I am. So we ended up just settling it with a smaller amount of cash. He said, he's a dealer, so he's not poor, but we basically arranged it in a way that I paid some money towards it. I believe it was $2,000, and that was to cover some of the damage to the bike and some of the damage to the car. Because the main things with the car were it needed a new tyre, a new headlight, and a new bumper, and the bike needed a new fairing, and crucially, a new exhaust. And obviously the titanium exhaust on a superbike is one of the most expensive components you can buy. It's like £1,200 alone. I think it was an Akrapovic exhaust or something like that. So the $2,000 towards it, he said he'd, pay the rest. And that was it. He drove me back to the car. We had a conversation the whole way. We were talking about bikes and cars, and he had no ill will. He actually appreciated the fact that I just took full responsibility straight away. And we had a discussion about basically what I'm talking about now, how that's an important thing, and he agreed. Because he wasn't a particularly old guy himself. He's like probably in his 30s maybe. And that was the end of that, basically. So after that, to cut forward in time a little bit, I then did a couple of the car reviews that I've been talking about, and then came the time to do another bike review. And this is where MV Agusta comes back into frame. For those of you who don't know anything about bikes, MV Agusta is essentially the motorcycle equivalent of Pagani. They're the Zonda of bikes. Yeah, that level. They are that level of motorbike. Super rare, very expensive, incredibly boutique in their construction. Basically the best Italian bike you can buy, if you can afford to. And they also happen to have made some of the fastest bikes ever as well. The one that I was supposed to be going to ride, and that I did go to ride, was an F3. An MV Agusta F3 800RC, which is like the full liveried, hardcore, 3-cylinder 800cc bike. So less power, slower than the BMW, but I didn't mind that. I didn't mind the idea of going back on something smaller. The problem was, I arranged this within 2 weeks of having the crash. So within 2 weeks, I was now getting ready to get on another superbike and riding it in another location which I was unfamiliar with, on roads that at the time were soaking wet because it had been raining, and there were also construction. There was also construction happening on the roads. I drove 4 hours to get to this place, And when I got there, I had no issues all the way. But then when I pulled up in the Touareg, and I looked out the window and I saw behind some railings this MV Agusta sitting there waiting for me. And as soon as I saw the bike, I knew that I couldn't do it. And I felt like such a pussy looking at this bike. But I knew that I can't do this. I'm not ready to get on a superbike again. It was too fast. I don't think I'd fully gotten over the crash itself. I was still probably trying to process exactly how and why and what had happened. And I just started speaking to one of the women who was there. She was the liaison for me riding the bike. And I explained to her about it. She didn't find it funny, and she didn't make a joke or make light of it at all. She thought that was the best possible choice not to do it. She actually complimented me, funnily enough, on what I do, because she asked me, do I own a bike? And I said, no, I ride other people's bikes to review them. And she said, well, that takes some balls to do that, because it means that every time you get on a motorcycle, it's new. So not only do you have to have the skills to do it, you're also learning a new motorcycle every time you get on it. So you've got no point of reference every time. And I hadn't really thought about that, but she was right. Every time I get on a bike, it's a totally new bike that I've never ridden before. And in a car, this is the crucial thing. In a car, it doesn't matter. Because if you get something, if something's a bit hairy or leery in a car, you just pull over. You just sit there, calm down, and when you're ready, move again. On a bike, you can't do that. I mean, technically you can, but you can't just stop on a motorcycle. You're balancing all the time, you're defensively riding all the time, you've got these hot, heavy clothes on, in my case, a crazy helmet as well, which is like looking out of a World War II pillbox, and then everyone on the road is trying to kill you when you're on a motorcycle, whether they know it or not. Just the way everyone drives in a completely dangerous way around motorcycles. Most of the time it's fine. But you start to notice it more when you've been in a hairy situation like that, and I just knew that I wasn't ready. I felt, and I've had this feeling a number of times, and usually when I have this feeling, it turns out to be true, which is kind of creepy. But sometimes I just have a certain feeling on a day, and I think something bad is going to happen today, and it does. And I think I had that feeling on that day with the Beamer, and then I crashed, and I had that feeling with the MV Agusta, so I didn't ride it. Now, of course, in hindsight, you can't possibly say what would have happened, but based on the circumstances, I don't think it would have ended well. I might not have died, but I still don't think it would have ended well. And I just didn't really fancy paying out for another bike. If nothing else, I didn't want to scratch up an MV Agusta, because compared to that, the BMW and an Audi would have seemed cheap to replace. But that was actually the only bad experience I've had in my first year. And it was just on one motorcycle. Nothing like that has ever happened in a car. I've had a couple of maybe close calls in a car, but even then, not really. Because I tend to be more of a defensive driver because of the fact that I'm a motorcycle rider as well. I believe, if any of you watch the Joe Rogan podcast, one of the things that he often says is he believes kids in school should be taught self-defense because it actually reduces bullying. But not for the reasons why you'd think. You'd think it would reduce bullying because kids would fight back. That's actually not the reason. It reduces bullying because learning combat teaches you self-respect. And if you respect yourself, you don't become a bully. Bullies are inadequate. That's why they become bullies. And I've actually started combat training recently. I'm boxing now. And I can attest to it. It does make you feel differently about yourself. It improves your mental state. But again, that's a discussion for another time. And if you guys would like me to talk about that, I could do an episode. But for now, my point is, I believe that everyone who has a motorcycle and a car license drives a car better because you appreciate what it's like to be on the other side. Most people who drive like an idiot around a motorbike have no idea what it's like to be on one. If you put those people on one, they would be wetting themselves and terrified immediately. Because on a motorcycle, there is nothing protecting you. There are no airbags, no metal. You might not have even thought of this before, but you know what? They don't even crash test motorcycles. Do you know why? Because you don't even stay on the bike when you crash. You fly straight off of it. So who cares if the bike has an impact zone? You're not going to stay on it anyway. That's something which most drivers don't even give a second thought to. You're sitting there in your comfortable big padded piece of metal, and chances are you'll be okay. On a bike, you've got none of that. You've got a helmet, which is 3 inches thick, between you and death, and that is it. And it never bothered me until the point where it did. Now, as I said, I'm actually planning to go back to the English Electric Motor Company to ride another bike. And the reason why is twofold. Well, actually three. One thing is that people who get bitten by sharks often get back in the water again. I don't want this to scare me off of bikes. I don't want to waste the training that I did, because I still love motorcycles. I love them in games and I love them in real life, and I don't want this to hold me back, and I'm not going to let it hold me back. Secondly, I know the roads in that area, and that is a crucial difference, because everything that you don't need to be stressing out about means that you're going to be better. You know, you can enjoy the ride more, enjoy the drive, and if you don't know where you are, well, you're focusing a lot of your attention on that, whereas because I've already been there twice, I know the area, and I don't have to worry about that. Third thing is, the bike itself is simpler. Again, it's electric, no gears, no clutch. It's just all of these things that you don't have to worry about as much or even give a second thought to. So for me, I'm definitely wanting to go back and do that. I have the confidence that I need to do so. I think that in the case of the MV Agusta, it was just too close in time and too similar of a bike to the BMW for me at that time. And part of me regrets that. Probably the biggest regret, I guess I could say. I mean, it's not like I lose sleep over it or even think about it that much, but one of the only regrets, in fact, of the past year is that I didn't ride the MV Agusta. Because MV Agusta is one of my favourite bike brands, and you don't get the chance to ride one that often, but I believe it was the smart choice to make, regardless of the regret. So I'm still moving forward with bikes. I still want to ride another electric one, and I believe that getting back on an electric one will probably be a good way of getting some of my confidence back as well, which is another reason why I want to do it.